No matter how experienced of a flyer you are, all of us experience some level of fear from time to time when it comes to traveling by plane. And while air travel is statistically the safest way to travel long distances, that doesn't mean that it hasn't had its fair share of horrific incidents. Famous events such as the Hindenburg Disaster or the horrific terrorist attacks on September the 11th, 2001 have remained burned into the memories of those that lived during their time of occurrence. However, there are plenty of other equally tragic air disasters that remain much less known. Welcome back to Facts Fanatics. We are dedicated to bringing you the most shocking and downright unbelievable real-life incidents that stunned the world. Today, we're taking a look at 10 horrifying air disasters that you've likely never heard of. Let's get into it. Number 10. R101 Airship, 1930. While many people remember learning of the horrors of the Hindenburg disaster, it is far from the only airship disaster in history that led to loss of life. In fact, 7 years prior to the Hindenburg disaster in 1930, a British prototype airship, codenamed R101, plummeted to its demise in a grass field in northern France. Upon impact, the R101 immediately burst into flames, taking the lives of 48 out of the 54 people that were on board. The only thing more unfortunate about the R101 incident than the loss of life was just how preventable the disaster was. From its initial construction, the R101 was known to be heavier than its ideal design was supposed to be. Because of this, a crucial safety tool which detected gas leaks was removed to lower the craft's overall weight. Worse than that, this was the R101's maiden voyage as an experimental airship, but the head of the British Air Ministry decided that it should travel to India rather than a quick flight. He also pushed through the decision to take off in the middle of a thunderstorm. His poor decision-making would not only sign the end of the R101's life, but his as well. He was among the 48 who lost their lives that day, including the entirety of the British airship program. Number 9. USS Akron Airship 1933. The USS Akron, much like the R101, was a more devastating disaster than the Hindenburg. In fact, the USS Akron's demise remains the deadliest airship incident in the history of the world. Also similar to the R101, its downfall was fully preventable as well. The USS Akron, a US Navy airship which regularly flew over the ocean, was never outfitted with basic aquatic safety gear, such as life jackets and rafts. Such security measures would have come in handy on April 4, 1933, when the USS Akron plunged into the water due to pilot negligence. The ship, along with the 76 passengers it had on board, was violently forced into the freezing water. While the disaster didn't result in a blazing, fiery explosion, it did cause 73 of the passengers to drown. 2 more died during the rescue mission, leaving just 1 left alive. While the demise of the USS Akron didn't directly lead to an immediate shutdown of the United States airship program, that would be its eventual fate. 2 years later, in the wake of the USS Akron's sister ship, also meeting a watery grave. Number 8. The Freckleton Air Disaster, 1944. At the height of World War II, during the liberation of Paris, another of the worst air disasters you've probably never heard of occurred in a small town located in northern England. In this town of Freckleton, in August of 1944, a plane's wreckage suddenly rained down from above, causing 61 casualties. The plane wreckage was from an American bomber that had become lost in a storm and had accidentally ended up over Freckleton. The storm caused the pilot to lose control of the plane, clipping a wing on a tree. The plane split into 2 large chunks as it approached Freckleton, one half striking 3 houses and a bar, while the other slammed into the town's local school. Number 7. The Santa Ana Airshow Incident, 1938. At the 1938 Santa Ana Airshow in Bogota, Colombia, all eyes were on the newest aircraft technology. The show was meant to showcase a new crop of daredevil fighter pilots, and many of Colombia's government officials and diplomats were in the crowd when the disaster occurred. Pilot Cesar Abadia tried to impress the onlooking crowd with a low nosedive right between the stands. He misjudged his approach, however, and clipped one of the plane's wings on the stands filled with government officials. The plane slammed into the spectators' area that was filled with civilians and then exploded in a ball of fire. When all was said and done, 45 people had perished and more than 200 received serious injuries, 7 of whom would later succumb to them. As bad as the incident was, it could have been far worse, as both the outgoing and incoming presidents of the nation were in the stands that day. Thankfully, both were spared their lives. Number 6. Japan Airlines Flight 123, 1985. The fatal crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 in 1985 remains the second most deadly plane crash in the history of the world. During the voyage, one of the plane's rear doors suddenly blew apart, causing the pilots to completely lose control of the aircraft. They attempted to turn the plane around and conduct an emergency landing. However, they accidentally clipped one of the wings against the surface of Mount Takamagahara, sending Flight 123 into a deadly dive toward the Earth. Flight 123 was completely filled, and among the wreckage were the bodies of 520 fatalities. These included 11 children, more than 20 foreign Japanese tourists, and a Japanese celebrity. Miraculously, 4 people survived slamming into the ground at 200 miles per hour, the lone saving grace surrounding this horrific accident. Number 5. The Stockport Air Disaster, 1967. In 1967, as the British Midland flight was returning home from Spain, the plane suddenly lost power during their final approach. As the aircraft plunged directly toward a heavily populated residential area, witnesses later stated that the plane got so close to their homes that they could physically see the passengers on board screaming and banging helplessly on their windows. The pilot of the flight did the best he could to avoid any densely populated areas, and when the plane finally did crash into the surface, it was away from any civilians, saving potentially hundreds from a fiery demise. The same could not be said for those on board, however, as 77 of the 84 passengers were burned to death in the plane's wreckage. Even worse than that, at the time the plane lost power, it was less than 6 miles from its intended runway. Number 4. The Mount Erebus Disaster, 1979. While no air disaster is ideal, there is certainly a tier list for better and worse locations for a crash landing to take place. Mount Erebus, an active volcano located in the frozen tundra of Antarctica, is probably the very last on that tier list. Nonetheless, it is the location of our number 4 worst air disasters you've probably never heard of. Air New Zealand Flight 901, a sightseeing plane that regularly took guests on excursions to view the Antarctican landscape, met its demise in 1979, when an unscheduled flight route led the flight into the direct path of the Gargantuan Mountain. When Flight 901 smashed into the face of the volcano, all 257 passengers were killed instantly. Even worse, because of the brutal Antarctic conditions, the retrieval operation was not a full success, and more than 30 of the passengers' bodies were never located. Number 3. The Avianca Cartel Bombing, 1989. The disaster of Avianca Flight 203 out of Bogota in 1989 was not due to mechanical or pilot error. In fact, its demise was caused by something far more sinister: a terrorist attack at the hands of one of history's most brutal and feared men, Pablo Escobar. Escobar, the leader of the Medellin cartel, discovered that a political rival was destined for the flight that day and ordered the plane to be bombed once it took off. Unfortunately, his plan went off without a hitch, blowing up the flight and killing all 107 passengers instantly. Fortunately, however, the intended target of the bombing, a presidential candidate and cartel rival, had changed his plans at the last minute and never boarded the flight. Number 2. The Superga Air Disaster, 1949. On May 4, 1949, a plane containing the Italian soccer club Gran Torino was headed back home from a match played in Lisbon, Portugal. On final descent, the pilot, hindered by a nasty thunderstorm, took too low of an approach. When the plane finally got below intense cloud cover, less than a second was left before they impacted the ground. Upon impact, the plane exploded, and 31 people were killed, including the entire Gran Torino soccer team and staff. The club had been a shining light in Italy and were on the brink of winning their league for a 5th consecutive year. Because of this, the entire country entered a state of mourning, and more than 500,000 citizens made their way out to view the team's funeral procession a few weeks later. Number 1. Iran Air Flight 655, 1988. On July 3, 1988, at the height of the Iran-Iraq War, a civilian aircraft departed from an Iranian airport, Flight 655. During the war, American warships were strategically placed in order to protect precious oil tankers and had orders to shoot down any incoming threat. Unfortunately, Flight 655 got a little too close, and the crew on board the USS Von Sen believed it to be an enemy F-14 fighter jet. The warship launched 2 missiles at the plane, blowing it from out of the sky, and simultaneously killing all 290 civilian passengers on board. In the weeks after, the Ayatollah made several claims of imminent retaliation against the West, and many believe that the tragic bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 was a direct response to the events of July the 3rd. There you have it, 10 of the most tragic air disasters of all time that we're willing to bet you hadn't heard about before. Thanks for watching. What do you think? What is the worst air disaster of all time in your opinion? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos just like this one.